Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Fridays with Daren. Today we have another very special guest, Mr. Brian McNoldy, who is a tropical weather expert and hurricane scientist, just here to offer us a unique and more rigorous view at weather than we typically would have the privilege of seeing. He's a full-time researcher at the University of Miami and a consultant for the Washington Post. So he's going to be talking to us today about what's been happening, what the actual research shows about what's been happening with hurricanes, particularly as it refers to South Florida. Also, of course, Fridays with Daren, we have Mr. Daren Goldin with us today to help contribute some really quality questions and uncover some insights. So thanks, Daren, for having this and for having me to come host this. How are you doing today?
Doing all right. Yeah, it's another Friday, so stoked to be here, stoked to connect with the world.
Great.
And I stoked to have Brian with us today. So very excited to hear what we have to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. What a privilege. Thanks, Brian. Brian, I'll let you introduce yourself further and kind of jump right into some of the things that you've prepared for us. I understand you've got some perspective to share with us about hurricanes and particularly how they relate to Florida and South Florida.
Yeah, right. Well, thank you. I appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to be here. Let me bring up a slide here. Get you guys going. All right, how does that look?
Looks great.
All right, thanks. So yeah, as Dane mentioned, I'm a researcher at the University of Miami's Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric Science. And so I mostly look at hurricanes, but I've also spent quite a bit of time over the years looking at local sea level rise issues, as the two are fairly linked here. So just kind of taking the big picture first, so you know what I'm going to be looking at over the next 20 minutes or so. Obviously, hurricanes have been a very significant threat to life in South Florida, basically since people have lived here, which you go back tens of thousands of years and people have lived here on up to right now, and in every bit of time in between that, hurricanes have been a problem here. It's a very big deal. One thing that's a bit more recent in terms of its impacts is sea level rise. We're kind of still in the first few phases of that, where we see streets flooding now and then. So we kind of tend to perceive it as a nuisance now, when in actuality it's a slow motion crisis. And then we have even the more broad scale picture of climate change. That's going to increase the impacts of both sea level rise and hurricanes. So I would say it's time to move beyond the if, when to now what. But let's start out with what is a hurricane, because as I said, it's a very big deal here, but not everyone knows exactly what they are. Basically, it's just a large, strong, low pressure system that tends to be found over the warm tropical oceans of the world. You have to have pretty strong winds near the center. The 74 miles per hour happens to be what that number is. But if you picture you're in a car driving 74 miles per hour and you stick your arm out the window, that is the lowest end of being a hurricane, is that wind that you feel in your hand. So that's just to get there. And then of course it goes up from there. A well-structured hurricane, one that's pretty strong and kind of has the look that we've come to expect. You have an eye in the center, which is calm, sometimes completely calm. Right around that, though, you have this ring of storms and heavy rain, and that is where the highest winds in the whole storm are found. right around the eye. So when you hear a hurricane referred to as a Category 2 or Category 3, that relates to some range of wind speeds, and then those are the wind speeds that are found just in that eye wall. And then outside of the eye wall, you've got things that are called rain bands. And in the loop on the lower right of this screen, you can kind of see all three of these features. You have an eye in the center, which is rain-free. Then right outside of that, you have that very coherent, strong ring, and then lots of rain bands that kind of spiral around and into it. Some of the, I mean, we think of wind with hurricanes, but there are other hazards that come with it that are actually even more significant than the wind. Rain, you can get enormous amounts of rain from a hurricane. It doesn't even have to be a hurricane, and you can still get lots of rain. The storm surge is basically when a hurricane gets close to land and basically bulldozes the ocean onto the land. And that can be 5 feet, 20 feet, 25 feet of ocean water pushed onto land. Obviously, that's a big problem. And then the other thing hurricanes are good at is they spawn tornadoes. So yes, you can have one inside the other. And all those threats exist far from the center. So when you see where a hurricane is going to track, usually it's just shown as a line. Well, a hurricane's not a line, it's big. This is just another view. This is taking kind of a vertical cross section, or if we were to cut a hurricane in half and look at it, you've got winds down near the ocean that are rotating into the storm, into the eye wall, up through the eye wall, and then out the top. And then you can kind of see what those rain bands look like there too. And then these kind of give a rough sense of how large these are. It's a huge range though of sizes. So now that we have a rough idea of what a hurricane is, this is a rough guide of when hurricanes have when we've had encounters with hurricanes here in southeast Florida. So what I did is I just drew a circle 100 miles across from Miami, and kind of see that encompasses basically all of South Florida. This goes back to 1851 through 2019, through each month of hurricane season: June, July, August, September, October, and November on the right. Three things kind of come out here. First is most of the activity is limited to August, September, and October. So that's good to know. I mean, yes, hurricane season does begin this week, but usually it doesn't really get going for a little while yet. So it's good to be paying attention and get your, get your hurricane prep in gear. But historically, we don't really have too many threats for another 2 months or so. Another thing that's interesting though is if you look at where the storms are coming from in August and September, it's generally from the south or the southeast. Then in October, they're almost all coming from the southwest. And not only does that switch, but October is when we typically have the most hurricane activity here. So here we are in June, first week of hurricane season. Everyone's got hurricanes on their mind. But it's not till October till we hit our peak. And so this is looking at what I would call a hurricane strike, which is when the hurricane force winds impacted Miami-Dade County. So usually when we talk about hurricanes hitting land, we call it a landfall. But that actually means that the middle of the storm has to cross the coastline, which, fine, that's what that is. But you could have a hurricane come really close to the coast, still bring all the storm surge and hurricane force winds and all that, but not technically make a landfall. So this takes care of that, and this says, okay, if a storm came close enough to bring hurricane force winds, we'll say it's a hit. And so this is for Miami-Dade County, as I said, and notice how concentrated this is. So we've got the Category 1 and 2 hurricanes in blue, and then Category 3, 4, and 5, which is the upper end of hurricanes, shown in red. And really, it comes down to about these 10 weeks is when the action for us has historically been smashed into. So it's a very concentrated part of hurricane season for us here. Now, let's look at this and how it spreads out over time. So not chunking everything together into a half-month bin, but going back to 1850, when did these hurricanes hit us? So again, it's the same scheme where a Category 1 and 2 hurricane would be in blue, and a Category 3, 4, or 5 hurricane would be in red. And one thing pops out here is you see a lot of activity, basically from 1965 back to maybe 1900. You can kind of see that window there where there's a lot of lines. And then more recently, it's been pretty sparse, actually. The orange line that's drawn on top of everything is how many people live in Miami-Dade County. That has gone up a lot. So if we look at a 50-year period, the most recent 50-year period, one major hurricane hit Miami-Dade County, and the major hurricane is the Category 3, 4, 5. One in 50 years. We go to the 50 years before that, we had 11 major hurricanes hit Miami-Dade County. Now, what's interesting is when all those major hurricanes were impacting us, quite fewer people lived here than there are now. It's almost unimaginable to have that level of activity transported to right now. I don't know what we would do. So we hope that it does not return, but there's no reason it wouldn't. I think a lot of this can be contributed to luck. You know, there have been some very strong hurricanes, and they just missed us. So let's look ahead to, okay, what might we expect from hurricanes in the future? As of now, there's really no trend that we can see in how many of them form. So how frequently hurricanes form. That just is not looking like there's anything there yet. There does seem to be some signal of storms getting a little bit more intense. So you might not have more of them, but the ones that do form are getting a little bit stronger. In general, there's not every storm is that way, but when you look at trends over many years, this is what comes out. And the other thing that's starting to appear is they're getting more wet. So a storm 50 years ago and the storm now is almost certainly going to be producing more rain. It's also important to point out that no hurricane or any other weather event for that matter is caused by climate change. Climate change is one of those background features that's acting on things, but it's not making things happen. But the last point is actually pretty important. Even if all the hurricane activity, whether it's frequency or strength or anything like that, even if that remained a constant, the impact from them would still continue to grow because we're putting more stuff in harm's way all the time. There's still people and stuff being built on the coastlines. So hurricanes can just keep doing what they're doing, and we're going to make them more expensive and deadly just because it's where people want to be, is on the coast. So let me shift gears now onto a not totally unrelated topic, as you'll see, sea level rise. On the really large scale, sea level rise is caused by two things. There's ice melt and the thermal expansion of the ocean. So those are what's behind the whole sea level rising in the world. Some places are going at different rates, though. For us here, actually, the speed of the Gulf Stream happens to be a big player, and that over recent years it's not moving as quickly as it used to. And so when that slows down, I should say the Gulf Stream is a kind of a important current in the ocean off the east coast of the United States. When that is not moving as quickly, it tends to allow the ocean level behind it to basically pile up. So from Florida up to North Carolina and Virginia, when that Gulf Stream is not moving as quickly, all those places start to see this happen, where the ocean levels rise. The problem is trying to predict these things. You know, people often talk about what's the sea level going to be in 2100 or something like that. There's an enormous amount of uncertainty around that because there are just things that are impossible to know, but people take a best guess at it. Here's what's been observed right here on Virginia Key, which is a small island near downtown. What I did, this goes back to 1996, and the light blue lines are each day, what was the high tide. The thick blue line is basically a 3-month mean of that, just so your eye can see what's going on a little bit more. And what I did up top is at these really high marks, I just said, okay, well, what made that high mark happen? 1999, we had a hurricane. 2005, hurricane. 2012, hurricane. Now you start to see some king tide events pop in here that are making entries that were just as high as what hurricanes were. That really started in 2015, and now it's almost a routine thing. Now we have these high tides in the fall each year that produce extremely high water levels. So things are changing, and they're changing in a rather short amount of time. This is using those same numbers, but I just made a mean each year. So what was the average? And these, for reasons I won't go into, I can go back another 2 years here. So these go back to 1994. And I just said, what was the mean sea level in 1994 on to 2019? And you can see it's got its ups and downs. Not every year is constantly up. So that's something to always keep in mind. If we look at the trend, say from 2006 to 2011, down. Well, if you ended this chart right there, you'd say, well, that's the end of sea level rise, all's well. So it's really, really important to not zoom in too much. You don't want to focus too much on what went on a year ago or 2 years ago. 2019, for example, is way higher than any other year ever was. A significant jump up from 2018. I would not expect that 2020 is going to be another equal jump like that. It could be not as high as what 2019 was. So what I want to show here is, okay, yeah, we do have a trend over about 25 years of 5.5 inches. And that includes the ups and the downs. When you draw a trend through all those ups and downs, we're up about 5.5 inches. That's a fairly big
very
deal.
significant. That's a very significant amount, right?
Yeah, that's a lot in 25 years. So let's start from where we are now in 2020 and look ahead. Like I said, we have a lot of uncertainty. So anytime you look at these curves of the future, you're going to see a range of them. There'll be from super conservative to which would say we're going to stop using fossil fuels right now, as is the rest of the world, and everything is going to be just great. Well, not that great, because we still have sea level rise that's going to happen because the oceans have absorbed so much heat that they're still expanding. Ice is still melting. We could shut off everything right now, and that's not going to solve the problem. Then on the far end of this, up top, is the extreme case where it's like everything we could possibly do wrong, we do wrong. And that it's not even on this chart. I didn't include it, but by 2100, that's up at about 10 feet higher than where we are now. Not good. But what I did, I kind of made the green and the gold lines a little more bold, and I did that on purpose, because if we go back to, let's say 2020, sorry, if we go back to 2000 and look at what the forecasts were for 2020, these two are about the most accurate. So that, as of now, they are the best fit. So I would say let's focus on those and then see the others as kind of the less likely wings. Not impossible, just not as likely. We certainly hope we're not going to be on the really high end, and if we hope that we're going to be at the low end, we might not be real happy. So I think it's a safe thing to look kind of in the middle and see where that gets us. So by 2100, that's another 3 or 4 feet of sea level rise on top of where we are right now. So that's 3 or 4 feet on top of every tide we see right now. And that's without hurricanes, that's without anything, that's just where the ocean sits. That's a big, big number for here, because there's lots of places that are 3 or 4 feet above sea level now. So let's take a look at what that would look like. Here's a rough look at the areas that have issues during the highest tides right now. So when I was showing that chart of, okay, now we've got some of these highest tides that are starting to produce pretty significant marks. This is about what it looks like. The areas in blue would be areas that flood during the highest tides. Green would be low-lying, not directly connected to the bay or the ocean, but water could come up through the drains and flood those areas in green. So basically, let's consider anything in blue or green is basically where we are now of what floods during the highest tides. That already is not that great of a picture. But if we go another 4 feet, and like I showed back here, that's kind of right in the midst of things. I picked the green and the gold line, which is a 3 to 5 foot range. Okay, well, here we are at plus 4 feet. That is not a good picture. So that is basically all of Miami Beach. Most of the islands between Miami Beach and Miami, the Miami River. It's not a great picture. So,
Brian, help paint this picture for me and some of our viewers. We're talking about king tide. We're not talking about the mean sea level.
Right.
We're talking about the worst case.
Yeah.
And so we're saying 2100. And so again, this is based on that average projection, or this is based on which one of those lines?
Yeah, this is based on basically right between the green and the gold. So I picked the 4 feet.
Most realistic.
Yeah.
And so let's go back to this one, and let's try to like look at it from the eyes of somebody that lives on let's say the Venetian Islands,
Sure.
San Marino or one of those. So they're going to experience this, and so we're talking about 4 feet. I mean, we're talking about water high enough to basically cover that whole first floor.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, what does this mean in terms of the damage? That means that they're changing out drywall. That means that probably the carpets are gone. Maybe a lot of furniture has to be replaced.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of years between the left and the right here, and it's just going to will fade from one end to the other. It's not like all of a sudden this is an issue that people are going to be faced with.
Right.
If they experience this high tide flooding, say 6 days a year right now, in another 20 years, that's going to be some higher number. And then another 20 years after that, a higher number still. So you'll gradually just ease into this. And in the meantime, some people are just going to decide to move. They might still love Southeast Florida and just move somewhere that's not as low lying. But these areas, we have on Miami Beach, we have the pumps, that big pump project, which is enormously expensive. Most places can't afford that. That will reach its limit of what that can do. I mean, that can't keep things dry forever. Some parts of Miami Beach and Miami, have raised roads, which again, that's quite expensive and not an obvious answer of, okay, so you raise the roads, but then what about all the property around it? That's a real problem that people have experienced.
Right.
I'm going to move on, but I hope we get back to this.
Does this erode the beaches?
Yes, this would have impacts on the beaches and everything. I mean, it's one thing you see here on the right side of the right figure is the easternmost, like the beachfront, basically is pretty high, and that always has been pretty high.
But that's artificial. That's because Miami pays to have sand dumped on the beaches every year, every couple of years, right?
Well, just for the beach itself, but that actual spine of it is a high point. It always was. The parts further west are what was filled, back in the 1920s and so on. It was actually just expanded because they wanted more land. Yeah, so there are parts right on the coast that basically becomes a key, if you will.
Right.
So it's going to be interesting to see how we get there and what people do in the meantime. Let me move on here, though, to kind of glue these two things into one. So, okay, we get hurricanes here, and we sit really low. That is what I would call a bad mix.
Yeah.
So really, and it's a pretty straightforward reason. If this is our high tides, in this example, it's 2010 because it's an older figure. It doesn't matter. Just make it 2020. You have, when a hurricane is coming, you have this surge that comes with it, and that could let's say it's 5 feet of storm surge. That's 5 feet of ocean water being pushed onto land. Well, at some point, that would be just starting to affect hotels and houses and things. But we fast forward a little bit. The mean sea level is higher. That same exact storm surge, same hurricane, all of a sudden, well, it's a worse picture. That same storm surge is now completely flooded the first floor of this house. And we fast forward again. The high tide itself floods the first floor of that house, And now the storm surge is acting on top of that to get even further inland. So that's where one builds on the other. So to wrap this up, hurricanes aren't going away. They're always going to be a part of life here. Unfortunately, they seem to be trending toward becoming stronger and wetter. Point two, sea level rise is not going away. That's trending upward and at an increasing rate. So, flooding due to storm surge, rainfall, and high tides, and their combinations. So don't forget, if we have a heavy rain during a high tide, that doesn't drain away as easily as it would during a low tide. So these things all act with each other. If we have a storm surge and a lot of rain and at high tide, that's obviously the worst case. But anyway, that's all going to become more frequent and worse as the baseline increases. So that's where we're at. What's the answer? I'm not entirely sure, but this is a graphic that I found where we can't just keep throwing money at a patch. That just is not going to work. And what is the answer? If I knew, I'd be ridiculously rich. It's going to take some really smart people to figure out how to handle this problem. But that's where we're at. So that is, I think, what I've got prepared, and I would love to have some more chat about this and some questions.
I thought you were just about to unveil the solution for us here on Fridays with Daren.
Wouldn't that be cool?
Maybe next week?
Yes.
Buy solar panels.
Yes, exactly.
So, all right. So you want to turn it over to questions, and we'll ask a couple. We'll see if we have some questions coming in from the internet.
Yeah, Elliot just let me know that nothing has come in yet from our social media, but is anything coming up for you, Daren? I've got a list here.
I got some questions. Last year, the big hurricane that we just dodged was Dorian.
Yep.
But they slammed the Bahamas, in particular Abaco and the other island that I don't remember the name of.
Yeah. That was actually the radar loop that I used as an example.
Yeah, so this is Dorian.
Yep.
Now you mentioned like a 5-foot storm surge in the later slide.
Yeah, just as
get on top of the king tide.
Yeah.
But I think that was way worse than 5 feet, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they can be. I mean, the record in the U.S. is like 28 feet. So, yeah, it can absolutely. I just picked 5 feet as an example of what it could be. But yes, it can actually. In 1992, Hurricane Andrew's peak storm surge in the Miami area was, I think, 17 feet.
Wow. And whatever Irma did, I mean, there was rivers in the streets of Brickell.
Yeah, that was about 4 feet.
Got it. Wow. So that's what 4 feet looks like.
Yeah.
Boats in the park in Coconut Grove.
Yeah.
And getting through Brickell in kayaks.
Yeah.
Wow.
Because on top of the storm surge, so when we talk about a storm surge being 4 feet, that's like the baseline of the ocean level, but you've got crazy waves and stuff acting on top of that.
So let me ask you this: king tide is seasonal?
Yeah.
What's the timeline of king tide? What are those months?
So we have 2 peaks of what the tides look like here, and I have this chart of this, but I don't have it included in this presentation. But
could you show that chart with the that has the
I
king
do
tides
have it. I do actually have it. It's just a little hard to see.
Yep.
On here, the black line, which repeats exactly the same, is what the seasonal cycle looks like here. So if we pick on just 1 year, it's pretty easy to see in 2019 because the blue line is completely out of the way.
Right.
So we have a small peak basically in April. Then it comes down to about where we are now, June. the big peak is September, October, and November. So the full range from the peak during what I would say is king tide season to the low, which is kind of December, January. That's about a 10-inch range. So that's what every tide acts on. So our tides are just naturally 10 inches higher in October than they are in January, for example.
Got it.
Yeah, I got to walk a king tide in October in Hollywood, which, we were just talking about Miami Beach and the southeast portion of the area, but this goes all the way up to other areas of South Florida as well, I guess.
Yeah, that goes up the East Coast. They're having the same, people can walk through flooded streets and houses up in North Carolina and Virginia and on up. This is definitely not just our problem.
So I guess the scary thing here is that it seems like hurricane season and king tide sort of overlap.
They sure do. A keen observation. Yes, not only is our highest normal sea level in October, that is also when hurricanes are most likely to hit us.
That's related, I guess. That's because of the temperature of the ocean.
Yeah, that is one of the ingredients.
It's not a coincidence. It's physics.
Yeah.
Wow. So what would you recommend to a Floridian that's like trying to make sense out of what to do with this information? It's one of those things that it's a very profound, very impactful, but it's slowly coming on. You're talking about 2100, right? I mean, that's 8 years away. I don't know if I'll be around then. It'd be cool if I would be, but how do we reconcile taking action when we talk about when it's really past that point of things have hit the fan, so to speak, being outside of our lifetime?
I think the way to look at it, there's plenty of people who are not urgently escaping. We all, this is where we call home, and that's just the way it is. It's not one of those things that's going to be a huge problem at any given moment. It's not some impact of like, okay, now it's a problem. Right. What we're experiencing now is just gradually going to get worse. So some of it comes down to what is your personal risk level? Like how comfortable are you with risk? If you live in a place right now that floods maybe 2 days out of the year because of high tides in October, and you're over that, I'm just sick of that happening, I'm out of here. Well, then your point of retreating is right now in 2020. Yeah. If you're kind of okay with that, like, yeah, it's a pain, but it doesn't last long, it's not very often. In another 20 years, it's going to be more often. And instead of 6 inches of water on your street, you might have 18 inches of water on your street. And you'd be like, okay, I'm kind of sick of this. I'm out of here. I'm going to I might not be out of South Florida. I might just move to somewhere that doesn't flood like this. Fine. So that's how it's going to happen. It's going to be people who are just getting uncomfortable with how often it happens. At some point also, and this isn't my new idea or anything, there are going to be insurance problems.
Right. Ask about that. Yep.
You're going to have insurers who are not willing to accept some level of risk, just as we are personally not willing to accept some levels of risk. They're going to say, I don't want to be bailing you out every 5 years from a significant flood. So bye, you're off my policy.
Right. That's one of the things that I remember always hearing in environmental circles, especially in Miami. When somebody buys a house, the majority of the time they take out a mortgage to pay for it, and the mortgage lender requires the borrower to have a homeowner's insurance policy.
Sure.
And so if we get to the point where insurers don't want to insure properties built along the coast, then that means that the average home buyer can't buy a home there, and that maybe only people that are buying homes cash can afford to can afford to buy because they can't get a mortgage. But the other thing is that they also have to take that risk on themselves. If they're buying a house with the knowledge of I cannot get insurance for this property. If anything happens, I'm on my own. I got to figure out how to pay for this myself.
Exactly. Yeah, it will. I think without any doubt, it will eventually become a place for the rich, basically, to live on the coast, because most people need to have a loan. They can't buy a coastal house with cash.
Yeah.
But if you can, and you're willing to live that lifestyle, it's all yours.
Yeah. So I was at a house yesterday in Miami Beach, just off of 41st Street area. Not the beach, but it was city of Miami Beach. Anyway, we were there to propose solar and power walls. The whole house is a modern house, beautiful house, probably built in the last year or two. The whole house was completely elevated, like we could walk under the house, and that's where we were looking at where we're going to put all the various electrical equipment that we'd install. But I thought this is very cool, and it didn't even occur to me until they started talking about it. This was built for these kinds of conditions. So I guess that's something that's been more common in the Keys. But do you think that's going to be the future, is just building elevated houses that you can walk up now, up to the stairs, and you can park here, but they're prepared for hurricane season to just take on 5-10 feet of water?
Absolutely. I think that actually is becoming the code in a lot of places, that if you're going to build, you have to build up some number of feet, just because of the risk level. So yeah, absolutely. I don't think that's even a thing of the future. I think that's a thing of right now,
Right.
as you just saw.
I mean, it definitely raises the cost of construction significantly.
Yeah.
Back to insurance. Besides being able to get a policy, it looks like the rates are going to be going up. I remember back in November seeing this article that I just pulled up again from the Miami Herald, that FEMA, I guess, has a role in mapping out what the flood risks are in different regions, and that was supposed to be released back in April of this year, but that it was delayed. And even without the new mapping that FEMA is supposed to do, they expect nationally flood insurance rates to go up by 11%. And so potentially, you were talking about the slow impact of this, that it's a slow motion crisis, but is that something that we're going to see kind of a binary switch where this new flood map comes out, and it maybe even if you can get a policy, it becomes cost prohibitive because the reality of flooding is become. Do you see that as being something more near term, or is that still, are we still looking to see flood insurance rates be reasonable or doable, I guess, even feasible? That seems like another dimension to me, I guess.
Yeah, I think that is in the near future, and it's because insurance companies have to. If they're in the business of making money, or they wouldn't be in business. And if they are writing policies for high-risk people and charging a relatively low price, that is not a business model that's going to work. If people want to live in high-risk areas, they have to be able to pay to live in high-risk areas, and that involves either not having insurance because you don't need to, if you don't have a loan, or if you want or need insurance, it's going to cost you. If you're in a high-risk area, you pay a high cost or a high price for it. It's just the way the insurance market has to work.
Sure.
What does that mean for the commercial, besides homeowners who can afford to live there as a as a luxury, as far as the real estate investment market goes? That that's a big part of Miami's tax base is real estate investment, commercial real estate investment. This has some implications for that as well, where it's not just about personal luxury, but the economic viability of development in these areas.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know. I don't know what to add to that. That is definitely something that that people are gonna have to work with.
What about groundwater concerns as the sea level comes up? I know this is maybe getting away from hurricanes, but like, for example, the Everglades and, even just our trying to maintain the integrity of our groundwater. How does some of these like sea level rise and king tides and also storm surge and hurricanes affect our access to clean drinking water in South Florida?
That's a great question. And it really does have an impact. It already has had an impact. So as the sea level rises, we're basically sitting on like a porous limestone sponge. So as sea level rises, the water table underneath us rises along with it. There's nothing to inhibit that. So the problem with that, not only will we can't make a wall around us like some places in the world can, where they're sitting on real rock. If you put a wall there, the ocean is not going to come in and get you. We could build all the wall we want, and it'll just come up from below our feet.
And I always remember what former Mayor Phil Stoddard told us when we had this conversation, that it's small lobsters, I think, or crabs.
Ghost shrimp, I think he said.
Shrimp, yep. Shrimp that have dug their way through the lime rock, right? That have made it so porous so that the water just comes up through the lime rock.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So we have that problem where a wall won't fix it. So we have that. And then part two is this thing called saltwater intrusion. So we have a freshwater aquifer that sits under where we live on the land. Then we have the ocean offshore. Okay, well, there's obviously going to be some zone in there where those two meet and blend. You have the fresh water under the land and the salt water in the ocean. They have this kind of zone where they mix, and that rises and falls actually during the year because of wet season and dry season. So does our land, does the how am I trying to say this? Basically, the saltwater intrusion problem is the ocean water oozes in and kind of takes over the realm of what was once fresh water. And so all the wells that we have down into what is now for fresh water, it's going to gradually become a problem, because if the salt water intrudes into that, then we start to pump up the salt water, which is, we can't make use of that. So yeah, it definitely will have an impact on that.
And we've already seen that, right? We've seen the wells getting brought in further.
Yeah, this has already happened in places. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard speculation that the lack of drinking water will be a concern before flooding. Just the idea that we're drawing so much from the groundwater combined with saltwater intrusion.
Yeah.
A real concern.
I mean, one area that we probably should be exploring is, okay, we live next to an ocean and we're worried about fresh water supply. Why not do a desalination plant, you say? Well, I don't know. They're extremely expensive, but what are we waiting for? We already know what the future is. The problem is not going away. Right. So why not start working on these things, or at least to put aside the funds year by year, because no one can afford to build one like, okay, here we are, let's make one next year.
Right.
It's definitely the future. A lot of countries are working on this. I'm originally from Israel, and I know that they've made major plants for desalination. But yeah, so desalination is very energy intensive. But then as a solar company, we like to say that energy can be abundant with a one-time upfront expense of building a solar farm. And then it just many years just continues to produce clean and renewable energy. One of the things that's interesting about solar is there's a trend for something called they nickname it photovoltaics, as in floating photovoltaics. And so they're these sort of floating pontoons, and you build a big kind of matrix of them, and then put solar panels on them. And I've seen the first system in Miami, just outside of the airport, and you can see it driving westbound on 836.
Oh,
Which is a great idea. And in fact, at one point, the developer talked to us about installing it, and our approach was, that's a terrible idea. We like the idea of floating solar systems, but not in South Florida, because we have hurricanes. So
yeah,
it's tough enough for us to get permits to put solar panels on buildings that
yeah.
are going to be structurally fastened to a concrete slab. It blew my mind as somebody in their right mind approved a floating solar system on one of those small, man-made lakes just outside of the airport.
Yeah. I mean, that seems like those could just get ripped right up, right? I mean,
All I can imagine is that what's going to happen is that if there's a nasty hurricane on the way, they're going to send out a crew and try to decommission it and take it apart and put the panel somewhere safely,
yeah,
as fast as possible.
yeah,
I guess one of the advantages to hurricanes is that they move slow, so you have some warning.
know they're coming.
But when it gets there, it's destructive.
So let me ask a question to you. When it comes to hurricanes, whether you're commercial or residential, I don't know enough about them, but what sort of winds are solar panels typically rated to? Is that a hurricane problem, or are they like really well attached?
So that's a great question, and I'm glad that you brought that up. Actually, we kind of touched on it a little bit in last week's session, because last week we talked about racking. Basically, I'm sure you've seen the Florida wind map with
Yeah.
bands that say, what the wind speeds that you need to be designing for, depending on where you live. South Florida, we have to design to withstand 175 miles per hour.
Okay.
Very significant. I mean, my understanding is that's kind of more or less where Andrew wind speeds were.
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, we are designing for it.
Okay.
We never install anything without a permit. So before we get to go and install, we have to pull a building permit, which means that the authority having jurisdiction has reviewed and approved our plans. And that could be one of 36 or 38 places in Miami-Dade County alone, and similar number in Broward. So we're talking about all the various municipalities. And so this is something that we're actually very proud of as a company that was born and grew out of Miami-Dade. We have evolved with, in my opinion, the strictest scrutiny in the country as it pertains to structural considerations, particularly because of hurricanes. So unincorporated Miami-Dade County is probably the most stringent, the most strict, the most particular, the most nuanced. But the lessons learned that we got from there, we've applied everywhere, even if it's Tampa or Orlando. And that's one of the things that we like to kind of advertise when we do sales, even if it's in places like Tampa, Orlando. We're taking the lessons learned in Miami-Dade and we're bringing it here. I've always thought that's very interesting that Miami-Dade has something called an NOA, a notice of acceptance, and that is a pre-approved system for how to install products. Typically, that applies to windows, that applies to roofing. I get asked a lot if that applies to solar. It doesn't. There is no NOA for solar because everything has to be custom designed. But when we design, the number of things that we're looking at is basically every single component in the system. So we're talking about, number one, how are you anchored to the roof?
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about the lag bolts or tap cons if you're embedding in wood or concrete respectively. We're talking about the depth of embedment in the medium. We're talking about the diameter of the lag bolt or tap con. We're talking about the distance from attachment to attachment, what's known as the span distance along the rail. So we do what's called a tributary area method. We figure out the area of solar panels that's to be attributed to one single stand, in the worst case scenario. So, we look at wind zones on a roof where wind zone 1 is the center, 2 is the edges, 3 are the corners. We look at what's called an exposure category, which is how high are you, how close to the ocean are you. Yes, we look at all these things. We look at dimension A, which is the width of that wind zone, and then we figure out the pressure that we have to design for. And so, I used the analogy last week that basically the chain is as strong as the weakest link.
Sure.
And you can think of a solar panel system that's attached to a roof like a chain, where it starts actually on the glass surface of the panel itself, because that's the thing that the wind is going to try to suck right out of the panel frame.
Yeah.
So panels are rated for pressure in both directions, downward or upward, which is also known as positive pressure or negative pressure, or snow and wind, because snow weighs down, wind pulls up. And of course, we never care about snow. And the weight of the solar panel system itself, what we call dead loads, because they're non-dynamic, they're fixed, is very, very low, right? Even though you think of a pallet of solar panels weighing a lot, they're by nature distributed completely over the entire roof. So a solar panel weighs 80 pounds, and it's approximately, no, I'm sorry, I got it backwards. It's 40 pounds, and it's 18 square feet. So that means that the actual physical weight of the panel itself is about 2 pounds per square foot. So the dead load, the downward pressure, is very, very low. So it's all about the upward pressure. And so, to go back to that chain analogy, it starts from the glass itself, and then it's the panel's frames, the metal frame, its ability to grip onto the glass. And then it goes from the glass frame with something called a mid clamp. That's the clamp that holds it to the rails. And then it goes from that mid clamp, holding it onto the rail, to the rail being held onto the standoff. It's like a 1-inch diameter cylindrical post. And that's the standoff that is then attached to the roof with lag bolts or tap cons if it's concrete.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I like to use the analogy that it's like a chain that's as strong as the weakest link, starting all the way from the glass that's interfacing with the wind, all the way down to the threads of the screw, the bolt, locking into the medium. That's the concrete or the wooden rafter. And typically the weak point is the solar panel. The industry standard is 2,400 pascals upward pressure. The panels that we use are 4,000 pascals or higher, because this is what we need to be able to meet Florida, code. We're very proud to say that we probably had about 600 or so systems installed throughout the state as of when Irma hit, and they were all pristine.
Wow.
Yep. My business partner, Joe, before opening up the second branch of Goldin Solar, worked in St. Thomas and also put in maybe 100 or 200 solar systems there. And then they had to live through Irma and Maria, and St. Thomas took on Irma and Maria way worse than Florida took on Irma. Maria didn't even pass by her. And our solar systems there did pretty well as well. Now they did sustain some damage, because if there's a flying 2x4 or a coconut or a piece of metal or some kind of debris that's going to just fly like a torpedo right into a panel, that panel will shatter.
Yeah.
But that one panel can be replaced. And so we've got photos of streets where there's houses leveled to rubble, just destroyed, next to houses that we put solar panels on that are still standing strong. And this is something that, we're very stoked about, and make a strong point when we sell solar systems, that if it's a house with wooden rafters, putting solar panels on top of that is like structurally reinforcing the house. It's fortifying the house, because if you've got rafters running this way and then you put on rails perpendicular, that amounts to like cross bracing. So your rafters are going like that, your 2x4s, 2x6s, and you put the rails like that. It's like an exoskeleton. And on top of those rails, we put on panels, which are also, framed this way and this way. It just locks up the house. So when the house wants to rotate and sway and do the things that hurricanes do to houses, the solar panels really help lock it in together. So those joints, those structural joints, stay strong.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Is there any sort of effect of, okay, the solar panels themselves are really strong, rigidly attached to their frame, the frame to the roof. What about that whole system acting like a kite and letting the whole roof come off?
Yeah. I haven't seen it yet.
Okay, well that's very good to hear.
But one point I want to make is we don't attach the solar panels to the membrane. We penetrate the membrane and we attach to the wooden rafters.
Yeah, no, yeah. So that's what I would say is like,
and then those rafters are tied, you know, to the walls and the tie beam.
Yeah. So as long as that
to continue
like
the
actual roof structures,
the foundation.
Yeah, yeah.
So we have it now. There's a product that's like a roof block that they sell and say, hey, put solar on your house with 0 penetrations. And so they spray the bottom of that block with foam, which is like an adhesive foam, and they're like, yeah, it's really strong. And then they put it on the roof, onto the tiles or the shingles or whatever the medium is, and it's in. They say so. They sell it as a no penetration attachment system.
Yeah.
And that's where I'm really worried about. Like you said, it's a low weight, large surface area that acts exactly like a kite. I use that analogy a lot. And with those roof blocks, I believe that it would just rip the whole thing right off, and it would just fly out into the abyss.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. Well, that's great to hear. That,
but you know,
it's a very strong system. It sounds like.
Yeah. I mean, my background, structural engineering, in terms of my education, it's not something that we take lightly. We certainly understand what this means to be installing solar panels in a place like Florida. And we've seen a lot of companies come in from California, Arizona, other states, and just say, hey, Florida's a good market. Floridians use a ton of energy because you know the air conditioner is an energy hog, and it's on all the time.
Yeah.
So we probably have maybe 1.5 or 2 times the kilowatt hour use per capita relative to other states. And so, I remember being in like a solar power convention, SPI, Solar Power International, and you're meeting your peers in the industry from other markets, and we talk about how our average solar system size is 10, 11 kilowatts. And we have residential systems that go as big as 30, 40, 50 kilowatts, depending on the building. And folks in places like California are mind blown from that because their solar systems are usually like 5 to 8 kilowatts. So we're installing much bigger solar systems, and we're installing them, much more fortified. But it's been all sorts of, means and methods that we've picked up. Instead of using L brackets that are attached at one point, we use a rectangular standoff that's attached here and here.
Oh.
So we're using double the lags or tapcons per attachment point. We're using a heavier gauge aluminum rail. We're using the stronger solar panels, maybe a larger lag bolt, maybe a longer lag bolt. So there's all sorts of things that we can do structurally to strengthen the system. Maybe 3 rails can be used instead of 2 rails. Or if we're installing panels on a standing seam metal roof, where in that case, we're not penetrating the roof, we're just clamping onto the seam. We turn the panels instead of portrait into landscape to maximize the number of intersecting seams, and we're attaching it on 3 points on either side. So now we attach at 6 points instead of 4.
Wow.
We've certainly gone through our trials and tribulations to learn how to make these systems as hurricane proof as they possibly could be. I certainly would never say this is hurricane proof.
Yeah.
Because hurricanes are a total wild card. I believe anything. A hurricane can do anything, right? I mean, if you put a tornado there,
you could get a very strong gust or something that's just, puts just that right torque or stress on something, and that is what it is. But no, that sounds way more robust than I ever imagined they could be.
we don't take this lightly. We take this very, very seriously. In terms of structural systems, in terms of our waterproofing methods for our flashing on the penetrations of the roof, and electrically. We use really good equipment that allows us to actively monitor the system and making sure that it's working. So we think it's a pretty sound investment.
Yeah.
And transitioning over to clean energy helps, right? So as you've shown, that best case scenario curve, that's the best. If that's the best case scenario, and it still results in a foot of higher water, essentially.
Yeah. The closer we can stay to that purple line down there, we all win.
I'm interested in that, Brian. What's the relationship? You're talking about how hurricanes form. What's the relationship between temperature and hurricanes? We kind of touched on it, and you mentioned it in the definition, but there's a correlation happening here. But what's happening to cause that increase in hurricane strength over time? Or
sure. So the way a hurricane gets its fuel basically is from the ocean. It needs, like I said, they form over the warm tropical oceans. So you're not going to get one to form anywhere too far north, too far south, depending on if you're in the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere. But the warmer the ocean is, the more intense they can get. So there are, I guess the way to put that, and there's two types of warmth too to consider.
Okay.
Not just how warm the skin of the ocean is, like the sea surface temperature itself, but there's this thing called the ocean heat content, which is how much energy is stored in the ocean. So it's how warm is it through a depth. That matters too for hurricanes. So if you have a hurricane moving over the ocean and only the topmost layer of the ocean is warm, and then it gets cool right below that, for example. The ocean, of course, when a hurricane is moving over the ocean, there's all sorts of big waves, and it's a mess, right? So it mixes a lot when a hurricane is over the ocean. If the ocean is warm, not just at the surface, but down fairly deep too, then it can mix and mix and mix, and you're only mixing in warm ocean with it. So that allows the hurricane to maintain strength. But going back to your original question, really what we typically look at, just to get the hurricane, not even a hurricane, to get a tropical depression started first, and then a tropical storm, and then a hurricane. There you are looking for areas that have the warm ocean temperatures. So with time, as the ocean warms, there are more places where this can happen, right? So places that might have been not warm enough before are now becoming okay, and places that used to be okay are now becoming really good. So yeah, it certainly does play a role.
So when we talk about average global temperature rising because of climate, does that relate exactly to oceans warming as well, or does that happen separately?
It's a little bit of a separate thing. It's an influence for sure. As the atmosphere warms, the ocean soaks up a lot of that. So the ocean has absorbed a lot of the heat that we've made. But when it comes to hurricanes, let me go back to the cross section that slice through a hurricane. One of the other things that's important for how strong a hurricane can become is not just how warm the ocean is down there, but it's how cold the outflow is up top. So the air is coming in in through the low levels, right near the ocean, up through the clouds, and then the outflow up top. So if what's important is the temperature difference between the ocean and the outflow than just having a warmer ocean, but you're keeping the outflow the same. Okay, that can get you a more intense storm. But what if the atmosphere is warming such that the outflow is also warm and the ocean is warmer? Well, that doesn't get you a net gain. So it's important to think of where the atmosphere is warming and how much the ocean is warming compared to the atmosphere. Like all that comes into play here.
So if I understand you right, it's the strength comes from the difference between the inflow from the ocean and the outflow into the atmosphere.
You got it.
So conceivably, if you had the atmosphere get warmer and the ocean did not get warmer, then you could actually see a reduction in the intensity of the hurricane?
Yes.
Just inside that hypothetical?
Yeah.
So what other things influence, so what I guess you mentioned the Gulf Stream as something that relates to the amount of water or the I guess how far the water comes inland, that has an influence on water level, I think was what I got from that.
Yeah.
Does that also influence temperature, or what are some of the things that go into warming the water?
The Gulf Stream isn't a huge player for that. I mean, that's a natural current that runs through the ocean. The ocean's loaded with, it's not just like some calm bathtub, it's loaded with warm currents, cold currents. Some of them move quite quickly, some of them are kind of slow, some of them are deep. You have deep ocean currents, you've got some near the surface. So it's like doing all sorts of crazy things. The Gulf Stream just happens to be a warm ocean current off the US East Coast. Warm meaning it's transporting warm water from the tropics northward. And this is why places like the UK and Northern Europe are as warm as they are. It's because of the Gulf Stream. It's transporting lots of warm water from the tropics, wraps around the US East Coast, up the north side of the Atlantic Ocean. And so it's an influence as far away as, why is it so warm in winter in England? Like, they're far enough north that it should freeze, and it hardly does. So anyway, yeah, it is an important ocean current, and it takes on basically what the ocean temperatures are. So if the ocean's warming, it's going to be warming too.
Give me just a second, my laptop is about to die.
Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now? Hello?
Okay, how's that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
One
you're
of the
good.
things that I found most useful for us as a solar company is that graph that you had that shows the intensity based on the month.
This.
No, keep going. The one that shows that's the one. That's the one.
Okay.
Our customers, what hurricanes mean to us as a solar company, beyond just having to design structurally strong solar systems, is oftentimes battery backup. Right, a solar system by itself will turn off when the grid goes down.
Right.
And the reason is, people having a bi-directional net meter have to make sure that they don't accidentally send power onto a downed grid. And so what we do to help people have power when the grid is down is add batteries to that equation. And now we do Tesla Powerwalls. Here's the thing from the customer's perspective. It's costly, and so solar panels are a no-brainer. And once a customer makes that decision, they say, all right, I decided, I paid my deposit, I signed my contract, get the system in ASAP. I want it as fast as possible, because as soon as I switch it on, I start saving money. Batteries are one of those things that it's like insurance. It's like if, as long as you don't think anything's bad is going to happen, you're going to say to yourself, why should I buy this? But the second that something bad happened, you're like, I wish I had it. So that's how batteries are. And oftentimes, we find ourselves, giving a proposal, giving a consultation to a customer, and the customer saying, all right, I'm kind of dragging my feet, I'm on the fence. But then as soon as that hurricane is a week away, that's about how much time we have, right? About a week from when they start to form. And at that point, it's anybody's guess. The spaghetti models are all over the place. So at that point, the customer calls us and says, all right, guys, I want the batteries. How quickly can we get them in? And the answer is 2-3 months. We got to go through engineering. We got to go through permitting. We got to go through all the processes. We can't just go in there and install them.
Right.
It has to go through the eyes of the building departments. So, to me, this is really interesting because it helps us understand the timeline, especially for the category 3 through 5, the kind that can actually knock off the grid.
Yeah.
When does hurricane season formally start?
It started on June 1st.
Right. That's what I thought. And so what's really cool about this is we can tell our customers, yes, hurricane season started, but the experts say that the nasty stuff can really get here in mid-August.
Yeah. And that's kind of how I always explain it too, really, is that the hurricane season is 6 months long, but it's really, the meat of hurricane season is 3 months. And this graph is just Miami-Dade County, but really it's August, September, and October is when the big stuff happens.
Right.
Sure, there are exceptions, but in general, August, September, October, that half of hurricane season is when almost all the action happens.
Yeah. We have a question from Elliot here. He said, will the peak of the season change as the ocean warms?
That's an interesting question. I don't think so. My initial hunch would be no. I think it would, you might expand the wings of it a little bit, like when hurricanes can happen, might fan out a little bit more into what we would not typically, when we wouldn't see much right now. So you might get a little more into the first part of the season, and toward the end of the season, those wings might come up. But the peak would probably still stay in mid-September or so. There's a few other reasons for that, because it's not just ocean temperature. There's also like the wind shear, or how wind changes with height. Hurricanes don't like a lot of wind shear. That time of year tends to have less than the first part of the season and the end of the season.
Sorry, what is wind shear and how does that affect hurricanes?
So wind shear is when winds at the low levels of the atmosphere and winds at the upper levels of the atmosphere are not in sync.
Okay.
So it can either be, one is blowing east and one's blowing west, or they could both be blowing west, but one's really quick. So it's something like if you imagine a hurricane as being some upright thing, some tube, you don't want to knock it over. So you want everything to be, if you're going to push that tube with your hands, you want to apply equal pressure to the top and the bottom so it doesn't fall over. That's kind of a way to think of wind shear. They like to remain upright.
And you said that wind shear, the difference between the different levels increases during which months?
Usually, so during the peak of the season, let me go in reverse. It is the peak of the season because that is generally when there's less wind shear, and that's part of why it is when it is. And then there's actually another ingredient. A lot of our strongest hurricanes in the Atlantic come from waves off of the African coast. And by a wave, I don't mean like a wave in the ocean, but it's actually a wave in the air. It's kind of a pre-depression. We have a weak depression, which becomes a tropical storm. Well, before it's even a depression, it's this thing called a wave. And these come off of the coast of Africa, every 3 or 5 days or so, all all during the peak of hurricane season. Excuse me. And so those those are most that's when they're most active. Sorry. Okay. So that's
several different factors together.
That's again why the peak of the season is when it is, because that's when those waves are the most active.
Gotcha. With the Gulf Stream, you said that that's slower lately. What affects, and that affects the water level, and it also sounds like it affects that if the Gulf Stream is slower, then potentially there could be more warm water that stays here. I don't know if that's a correct assumption.
It's not that much of an impact on that.
Okay.
It is, yeah.
What affects the Gulf Stream moving? Is that a distance from the sun thing, or what affects the Gulf Stream?
So they're in the really big picture, that can be related to how much ice is coming off of the Arctic and Greenland and things like that. Kind of gets into those deep ocean currents that I was talking about before, because they're all linked. So you can't have one current doing its own thing and the rest of them are just like, hey, you do your thing.
Right. It's pressure. It's got to have somewhere to go and come from.
Yeah. So there are really large ocean circulations and things like that. And if some piece of that is slowing down somewhere else or speeding up, that makes that part of it slow down or speed up. And that's, I mean, we don't actually care what's going on in the deep currents, but they do have an impact on things that we do care about.
Gotcha. Do you see the ice melt that we're seeing as a result of warming having the potential to affect some of those deep currents and therefore affect things like the Gulf Stream?
Absolutely. Yep.
Are we seeing that? Is there data to support that that's happening?
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I've never really gotten to think about or really had information about any of that dimension of, our climate, I guess. I feel really interested now to go down the rabbit hole and learn about deep ocean currents and.
Yeah. Oh, because you think about it, when that ice melts off of there, it's really cold, right? So that as soon as that cold water enters its new world of the ocean, it's going to go deep.
Oh, because the warm water rises.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. What about, you showed the kind of spaghetti graph of you said that the hurricanes switch direction in October. I just thought that was really curious. You showed how they start coming from the southwest more in October versus the southeast. Is there an easy explanation for that?
Yeah, there is actually. So it revolves around where they form. During August and September, most of them are coming from those waves off of the African coast that I mentioned. So they're traveling all the way across the Atlantic, and some of them just happen to find South Florida. The ones in October, though, tend to be coming more from the Caribbean or the Gulf of Mexico. And that's just because as the months move along, some spots become more favorable for hurricanes.
Got it. So it has to do with the where the wind, how the wind changes over that month, and that there's more warm air coming from areas more in the southwest direction. So I'm understanding
it's just there's different ingredients again, like the wind shear, the ocean temperatures, all those things. They kind of move around during the season of where storms are most likely to form, and so that's the result of that is that they don't always come from the same place.
Gotcha. One last kind of category that I wanted to touch on is the idea of citizen science, and I know Elliot had brought up that you take some of your own measurements for rainfall, and just like the importance of that. I guess maybe it's really valuable to have data points from individuals who are able to provide that kind of information. But can you speak to why that's something that you like to do, and maybe why that's important and what that contributes?
I would, and as luck would have it, because I showed stuff from a lot of these, I threw this in as a slide at the end. So that one slide we were just looking at of, this is where these hurricanes came from in this month and in this month. That came from the first site here. You can look at all the past hurricane activity, all the sea level rise stuff, and if you want to look at the numbers coming out of the gauge at Virginia Key, for example. That's actually in number 3 there, the tides and currents link. The sea level rise link, number 2, is that example that I showed where this is what floods during king tides now, and then this is what could flood during king tides in 2100. That comes from that site. And number 4 on here is COCO-RAS, which is the Community Collaborative Rain and Hail Study. That goes back to 1998. And what that is it's just your normal person who once a day reports rain or snow that they got. How much rain did you get in the last 24 hours? That's all it is a once a day. And if you have snow, you melt down your snow and, see how much you got. So I've participated in that since I've lived here, so that started in 2012 for me. So I've got once a day rainfall measurements at my house over 8 years, and you can do all sorts of cool stuff with those numbers.
What do? You just set like a measuring cup out in the yard or something, or
So they have a rain gauge that you have to get. It has to be the same rain gauge. So every one of these people, and they're not just in the U.S. anymore. They're in Canada and Mexico and the Bahamas, and I don't even know where else. But it's the same rain gauge. Every person has the same rain gauge. So that kind of takes care of that problem.
Gotcha. I'll leave my measuring cup in the kitchen then. So this, like, because people can just create their own data and submit that provides a unique perspective to what's happening, to have that sort of data that you otherwise couldn't get. Is that right?
Yeah, it's really important actually. And that's how COCO-RAS was born. There was a flash flood in 1997 in Fort Collins, Colorado. And just across the town of Fort Collins, there's a range of like 2 or 3 inches to about 14 inches. Unfortunately, the 14 inches fell on the west end of town, which it kind of, the whole city kind of sits up. So it's, the high end on the west, the low end on the east. So you had this crazy heavy rain over the west side near a creek. That resulted in an enormous flash flood, like really big deal. And so they were thinking, well, if only we had a clue, like how you have 3 to 14 inches across a relatively small town. So the idea came about, like, okay, we need to be able to get this kind of high density rain gauge network going, so we can really see what's going on here. And that's how it originally began, but then it spread from state to state and then from country to country. And so now there's loads of reports. You can go to that website and see a map each day. And I'm on there each day as my own one dot out of all of them.
Very cool. Yeah. Well, that my brain is full. I've been really enjoying the conversation. Thanks for answering all my questions. Daren, did you have any more things that you wanted to bring up?
Unmute here. No, we covered a lot. That's really, really cool stuff.
Thank you, Brian.
Oh yeah, that was my pleasure.
Yeah, this is
Thank you.
really helpful information. I guess where do you see this going in the future? What about this particular year, right? I mean, we've read articles that said this particular year is going to be a little bit worse than previous years because of the temperatures of the ocean.
Well, it's a little soon to say yet, I guess, but in general, yeah, we've been having abnormally hot years. I don't know why this wouldn't be, and I mean, because it depends on what you consider to be abnormal. So we usually use, like the 30-year baseline or something like that to say this period is what we're going to say is what defines what is average. And so, yeah, if you have a year that's above that, it's above normal. If it's below that period, then it's below normal. So, yeah, we've had a lot of above normal years, and I don't know why this one wouldn't be.
Right.
Is there a baseline for frequency? Like it looked, like in the 20s and 30s and 40s that there was a lot more storms. Is that, have we been, like you mentioned, the aspect of luck, have we been under average lately? Like would it be reasonable to expect the frequency of hurricanes to increase? Or do you think that period of, the 20s to the 50s being just ridiculously above average and that shouldn't be seen as reasonable to expect?
That's a really good question. It does seem like there's a bit of luck involved, that recently we did not have as many. It's a very strange thing by eye to look at this and see how few hurricanes have affected this area in 50 years. It's very unusual. All we can do is hope that continues, but there's no reason that it should. I mean, it's like I said, the hurricanes are not really changing in frequency very much. So there's about as many happening now as there were before. It's just a matter of where they hit.
Oh, I see.
And, yeah.
There are plenty forming that don't hit Miami.
Oh, yeah.
Gotcha.
Right.
I understand. Okay. Got it. Well, thank you, Brian. I think I don't know if this was by design or not, but it seems like each week we've been filling in another piece of the puzzle. So a couple of weeks ago, we talked about climate in the historical perspective and trying to understand how we're arriving at the temperature increase that we're seeing. And then I think now this week we've seen what are some of the results of an increase in temperature? What implications can that have for our climate, for hurricanes and for sea level rise? And I think just to give a little preview to next week for those people who are tuning in, next week we're going to look at climate justice, and we're going to talk about what some of the effects of climate change, how that affects people and people in different socioeconomic backgrounds. And I think specifically as it relates to our area here in South Florida, we're going to have someone from the Dream and Green organization, Barbara Martinez Guerrero, who is a local nonprofit leader who's going to help us speak to what does this really look like when we have increased storm surge and increased water levels for people. We talked today a little bit about how it may be less attractive to develop in areas that are more at risk. In Miami, it's known that the higher elevation areas away from the coast are traditionally where lower income populations were pushed to, and now we have this issue of climate gentrification, where we see real estate developers and investors wanting to, pursue more activity in those areas, which were previously for communities of lower income. And so I think really getting into the human impact of some of this research that we've looked at and the historical context that we looked at a couple of weeks ago. So I'm looking forward to carrying this through to really connecting it to what does this mean for people in Miami? Obviously, it's very timely right now as we address aspects of equity in other parts of our structure of our society. So thinking about climate in that same regards of, does this disproportionately affect people of color? Does this disproportionately affect people who have less means to adapt? So we're going to talk about all those things next week, and I think this has given us a really strong base to see what really will be happening, so that we can look at what the effects of that will be for different people. So thank you so much, Brian.
Yeah,
this has been absolutely a privilege.
Thank you.
So, right on, and we'll be cutting up this video and publishing some of our favorite clips with our insights from this conversation. So if you're watching this, please follow us on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter at Goldin Solar. And we would love to be able to continue to share this info so that people can stay educated about these things. That being